Chapter 739. A Woo. A long wolf howl came from the depths of the forest. Ning Xuemor's footsteps paused. There were wolves. It seemed like there were still ferocious beasts in this forest. With her current ability, she naturally wasn't afraid of wolves. Even if there were 8 or 10 of them, they wouldn't be able to do anything to her. However, since there were wolves, there would be other ferocious beasts. Just in case, she had to bring some weapons or hidden weapons with her. She looked at the iron-gray branches. These branches looked very hard. It shouldn't be a problem for her to make a stick to defend herself. Xuemor had always been cautious. She first used the silver hairpin on her head to scratch the tree trunk. She wanted to see if there was any poison before climbing the tree. However, after the silver hairpin scratched the tree trunk, her heart slightly jumped. With her current strength, even if it was refined iron, this hairpin would still be able to make a scratch on it. However, after she scratched the tree, she didn't even leave a mark. Isn't this tree too hard? She tried scratching it a few more times, but it was still useless. After she scratched it a few times, she felt that the ghost faces on the tree trunk were mocking her. The corners of their ugly lips curled up, her heart trembled. Was she seeing things? She turned to look at the other trees and compared them with the one she scratched. She suddenly took a step back. The ghost faces on this tree were indeed different from the other trees. The ghost faces on the other trees drooped their lips and drooped their eyes. They looked like they were crying. Only this tree was smiling. Even though she was brave, she still felt the hair on her body stand up. She took another step back and her back hit another tree. Then, as if she was burned, she jumped forward a step. The force she used to hit the tree was very small, but her back felt like it was stung by a wasp. It was painful and numb. The small piece of muscle she hit was actually hard and numb. This tree was poisonous. And it was a kind of poison she had never seen before. A woo. A woo. Not far away, there were several wolf howls, as if some wolves had found prey and were calling for their companions. Ning Xuemor's expression changed slightly. She suddenly jumped and ran in the direction of the wolf howls. Di Zun was in that direction. He was still lying there. When he fell, he used his body to protect himself. It was his body that broke the branches of the ghost face tree. This tree was so hard, it was as hard as iron. He was lucky that he didn't get skewered. There was an 80 to 90% chance that he was really injured and had fainted. He had left him there. If he was bitten by the wolves here. Fortunately, Ning Xuemor's sense of direction was exceptionally good. Like a gust of wind, she directly rushed back. From afar, she could see pairs of oily green eyes flashing in the dense forest. Wolf pack. One of them was especially tall and sturdy like an ox. It even had a horn as sharp as a blade on its head. This was obviously the alpha wolf. These wolves were crazily biting the protective white light around the ancestor's body, causing the white light to tremble incessantly. As for the alpha wolf, it used the sharp horn on its head to stab the white light. Every time it stabbed, the white light would emit a kind of popping sound, as if it would break immediately. Fortunately, the ancestor's body had a protective spiritual energy. Otherwise, when she came back, she was afraid that she would only be able to pick up a few pieces of his bones. Ning Xuemor rushed over. The wolves surrounding the ancestor were obviously not easy to deal with like the other wolves. When they attacked, their bodies were like lightning. Their sharp teeth and claws flashed with cold light. Ning Xuemor threw 7 or 8 stones in succession, but they were all neatly dodged by them. Chapter 743. Ning Xuemor finally arrived in front of Di Zun, but she was alone after all. Under the continuous attacks of the wolves, she couldn't take Di Zun away. She could only protect him behind her and fight with the attacking wolves. While she was busy, she also looked at Di Zun's face in the white light. His eyes were closed as if he was meditating, and even his breathing was very weak. She could barely see the rise and fall of his chest. Di Zun was still wearing the mask, so Ning Xuemor couldn't see his face clearly, so she was a little uncertain. She could only call out to him, Di Zun, Di Zun. Di Zun, wake up, wake up. Of course, her call had no effect on him. Master, Master. Ning Shuemor was fighting with the wolves when Karine's call suddenly appeared in her mind. Ning Shuemor was a little surprised, and then she was overjoyed. Recently, Karine had been unreliable. Every time she was in danger, it wasn't by her side, so when Ning Shuemor was in danger, she forgot about it. At this moment, when she heard its call, she was overjoyed. She didn't want to talk nonsense with Karine, so she directly told Karine where she was and asked it to hurry over. Karine was the king of all beasts. As long as it came, it could scare away the wolves. Fortunately, Karine was also on Buddha Lotus Mountain. Fortunately, there should be no enchantment on Tianyin Peak now, so Karine should be able to enter and come to this place smoothly. Karine had caused a lot of trouble recently, so Di Zun asked it to stay in a place to reflect and not to disturb its master for a few days. It had been very obedient these days, cultivating and practicing martial arts obediently, even more obedient than a house cat. It had not been separated from Ning Shuemor for a long time, so it didn't know how she was recovering. It was actually very worried about her. Today, he had tried to contact his master. It planned to just say a few words to its master. Di Zun wouldn't know and wouldn't punish it. However, it didn't expect to know that Ning Shuemor was besieged by a pack of wolves. It immediately jumped up. Its chance to perform a meritorious deed had finally come. It wanted to punish those wolves who didn't know what was good for them. They actually dared to besiege its master, the king of all beasts. They were really tired of living. It followed Ning Shuemor's direction and ran through the bamboo forest, and saw the White Tower. Karine had practiced the cloud riding. After it heard that Ning Shuemor fell from the White Tower, in order to land quickly and accurately beside Ning Shuemor, it had to give its all. According to Shuemor's words, it's only needed to jump from the top of the mountain. It was afraid that it would make another mistake, so it jumped with all its might towards the White Pagoda. It wanted to jump on top of the tower first and then it's before jumping down. However, it didn't expect that when its claws touched the White Tower, it immediately felt that something was wrong. Chapter 744. Karine's scream was accompanied by a series of crackling sounds. Finally, it landed on the ground like a thunderbolt. Bang! The little Cheline felt as if it had smashed into an iron-grey living animal. It was hard but slightly soft. It hurt so much. Karine fell on its back. Stars were flying in front of its eyes. Its body was burning with pain, as if it had been electrocuted. It was still worried about its master. It endured the discomfort and jumped up. Its nose smelled blood. It looked down and saw a tall wolf on the ground. It had been smashed into a pancake. Needless to say, when it fell, it had hit the unlucky wolf and made it its cushion. The wolf was here. How could its master crush it? Karine shook its head to shake off the little stars that were still flying in front of its eyes. It looked around and finally saw its master. Ning Shuemor was holding a man in white whose back was dripping with blood. She was staring at it with lingering fear. It was too close. When Karine fell, it almost hit Di Zun who was lying on the ground. Ning Shuemor saw that it was falling in a bad way and reacted decisively. It was strange that at the critical moment, Ning Shuemor broke through the wizardry barrier and dragged Di Zun back a few steps. She was also afraid that this reckless Karine would fall to its death, so she kicked a wolf that had just rushed over. It happened to be in the direction where Karine landed and became its cushion. The pack of wolves was shocked by the sudden landing of this huge monster. They all stepped back and looked at it from afar. Master. Karine ran toward Ning Shuemor. Master, are you okay? Who is this person you are holding? So much blood. Ah, Di Zun. The last few words turned into an unbelievable scream. Ning Shuemor rubbed the space between her eyebrows, feeling a headache. Didn't I tell you to fly down? What a pity that you didn't tell me the approximate distance. It still came crashing down like this. Karine also felt wronged. This place is different from other places. There's a suction force here, so we can't use the cloud riding technique. The scales on its body were thick, and at the critical moment, it had used its claws to push away the branches that were blocking its way. With the wolf at the bottom, it was not seriously injured, and only a few scales were scratched on its body. Even so, it was in so much pain that it wanted to stomp its feet. But for the sake of its master, it endured. Kireen looked at the wolves that were scattered in the distance but refused to leave. He felt a little strange. It was the king of all beasts. Even if it was a lion or a tiger, when it saw it, it would be scared to the point that it would shrink into a ball like a chicken. Its roar could make them run away in fear. What's wrong with these wolves? He wasn't afraid of it. This doesn't make sense. Chapter 745. In other places, when Kireen met with those beasts, he would scare them. With his identity, those beasts would be scared witless. However, the wolves here dared to fight with Kireen. Ning Shuemore knew that Kireen's real ability was not very high. Once they fought, he might not be a match for these wolves. There are too many wolves. He is no match for them. A voice sounded behind her. Ning Shuemore's body stiffened. She abruptly turned her head and saw the ancestor leaning against a large rock. Behind the white jade mask, his eyes were already open. His line of sight fell on the little Cheline in the distance. Kireen had been surrounded by wolves. From time to time, various howls could be heard from the circle. Blood flew from time to time, and under the thin sunlight, it was a tragic beauty. Ning Shuemore was holding the ancestor and couldn't avoid the attack of the wolves. So, she put him on the big rock and guarded him. Seeing that he woke up, Shuemore was relieved. Ancestor, where is this place? The ancestor glanced at her indifferently. This is the dark forest. It was originally the place where I trained my disciples. So, this is the dark forest. Ning Shuemore had heard Yi Qingwan mention this place more than once. She had always thought that the dark forest was some barren place outside Buddha Lotus Mountain. She didn't expect that it was under the White Tower, so, this is the ancestor's territory. Then, these wolves, are they also reared by the ancestor? Reared wolves? Did he think that he was very free? The wolves here were born from the hostility of heaven and earth. Every tree here has countless wolf souls imprisoned. When one group falls, another group will come out from the wolf soul tree. They are endless and can't be killed. It was rare for the ancestor to open his mouth and explain so much. So, these ghost-faced trees were called wolf soul trees. Then, the ghost-faced faces on the trees were actually wolf faces? If that was the case, it was indeed inexhaustible. She pondered for a moment, and a fierce wind came from behind her. She didn't even look back as she turned around and stabbed two wolves that were about to sneak up on her from behind, preparing to launch a sneak attack, sending them flying. We can't stay here. We have to leave quickly. 30 miles southeast of here is a body of water called Buddha Lotus Lake. Wolves don't dare to go there. The ancestor spoke again. He was obviously very weak. After he finished speaking, he was a little short of breath. Ning Shuemore actually wanted to ask him why he was so weak, but at such a critical moment, it was naturally not the time to chat about such trivial matters. She nodded slightly and said, "All right. Then let's go to that Buddha Lotus Lake." He then looked at Di Zun and asked, "Di Zun, is it convenient for you to walk by yourself?" If an ordinary person had suffered such an injury, they would naturally not be able to move. But as for the ancestor, Ning Shuemore always felt that the ancestor would never fall. He was omnipotent. The ancestor glanced at her, a faint light flickering in his eyes. "You want to abandon this king again?" Ning Shuemore was stunned. She remembered what she had done just now. It seemed that she had indeed abandoned him. However, she did not think that he was really injured and thought that he was faking it. Hey, he was obviously unconscious just now. How did he know that she had abandoned him? This king didn't faint. I just couldn't move at that time. The ancestor's words cleared her doubts. His thin lips behind the mask slightly pursed. "I'm sorry." Ning Shuemore was actually very guilty. Because of her mistake in judgment, the ancestor had almost died in the mouth of the wolves. She did not rely solely on her psychokinesis to kill the pack of wolves. Instead, she relied on her quick reflexes and the ability to break the formation, as well as her magical footwork. This girl's performance was even better than his disciple who possessed Earth Realm psychokinesis. When the little Cheline fell, she didn't care about the pack of wolves behind her and pulled him away in the nick of time. Compared to her own body, she was very petite and exquisite. Unexpectedly, the petite Shuemore was able to carry him quite easily. While she was dragging him, she saw the wound on his back and sucked in a mouthful of cold air. While he was avoiding the little Chalene's Mount Tai smash, he clearly heard Shuamore whisper in his ear, "I'm sorry." These 3 short words warmed his heart quite a bit. Chapter 747. Now that he heard Shuamore apologize, Di Zun looked at her with an unfathomable gaze. Ning Shuamore felt her scalp tingle under his gaze. Under his gaze, there seemed to be an ambiguous feeling lingering around him. She blinked her eyes. Now was not the time to think about these messy things. She looked at Di Zun, who was injured and unable to move, and thought about the current situation. It was not realistic to carry him on her back and run away. Otherwise, once they were surrounded by wolves, she would be helpless and unable to kill them. She glanced at Kirin, who was not far away, and clapped her hands. Got it. She immediately summoned Kirin. A moment later, Kirin broke through the wolves' encirclement and ran back. It was probably the first time that Di Zun had fought so hard. His eyes were bloodshot, and his whole body was filled with a murderous aura. "Master, what's the matter?" Although it had suffered some injuries, it had still bitten and killed many wolves. When Di Zun had rushed over, he wanted to fight with the alpha wolf. However, the alpha wolf was very cunning. It hid behind the wolves and howled to command the other wolves to fight with Di Zun. Di Zun could not rush over at all. After all, Di Zun was a mythological beast. His blood was domineering. Di Zun had not encountered any real danger before, but now that he was in such a situation, the wild nature in his body was stimulated. It was the first time in his life that he was able to kill so many enemies to his heart's content. After such a fight, Kirin seemed to have changed a little. Of course, Ning Shuamore did not notice these changes at the moment. When she saw Kirin coming back, she did not say anything. She picked up Di Zun and put him on Di Zun's back. She quickly ordered, "We have to break out of the encirclement. You take Di Zun, and I'll stay behind." Kirin was obviously not satisfied. A mythological beast was bitten by wolves. It's too shameful. Di Zun looked at Ning Shuamore's face and added, "Besides, once we run away, they will chase after us. It's better to stay here and fight with them." Ning Shuamore frowned. She seemed to have spoiled Kirin too much. Di Zun did not know that sometimes he had to obey orders from a superior. Instead of refuting and asking why, when she was the boss of the Secret Service, her subordinates had always carried out her orders unconditionally and swiftly. They had never questioned the orders of their superiors or tried to refute them. One had to know that the situation on the battlefield was constantly changing. It was impossible for the commander to explain every order to his subordinates. As the saying went, military orders were like mountains. As a subordinate, he had to carry them out regardless of whether he understood them or not. Ever since she came to this continent, she and Kirin had been relying on each other for survival. Kirin looked so cute that she unknowingly kept it as a pet. Although his voice was weak, it was still extremely magnetic. Ning Shuamore didn't know what to say. Fortunately, she was quite strong now. If she was an ordinary woman, she would have been directly pushed off Kirin's back by such a big man. However, he was really weak now, so weak that he couldn't even sit on Kirin's back. It seemed that leaning in her arms was safer. At this time, Ning Shuamore didn't have time to think about other things. She still had to deal with the wolves that would jump over and bite them from time to time. Fortunately, Kirin was very reliable this time. It ran fast and steadily. Every time it made a sharp turn or jumped over a tree, it would remind them, so that the 2 people on its back wouldn't accidentally fall down. It turned out that the pack of wolves that were chasing after them were unwilling to let the delicacy in their mouths escape just like that. They actually wanted to step on the Buddhist lotus and chase after them. However, for some reason, the lotuses suddenly softened when the wolf stepped on them. With a casual shake, the wolf was swayed into the lake. The lake water looked sparkling and translucent, and it was incomparably sweet. However, when the wolves fell in, it was like falling into sulfuric acid. After letting out half a miserable howl, they melted into the water, and not even a strand of fur was left. When the other wolves saw this, they didn't dare to chase after them anymore. They just stood on the shore and howled at the two people and the beast. Kareen was proud and also howled back. Only then did it continue to follow Ning Shuamore's instructions and go deeper into the lake. Gradually, the pack of wolves on the shore lost all hope and slowly dispersed. At this time, Ning Shuamore finally heaved a sigh of relief. It was only at this moment that she was able to calm down and secretly check on the ancestors' injuries. She secretly sucked in a breath of cold air. "After I'm done, you can." Before she could finish her sentence, her body suddenly tightened and then lightened. She was once again lifted into the air by the ancestor. "Ning Shuamore, be good and don't move." The ancestor opened his mouth and walked step by step toward the jellyfish with her in his arms. This time, Ning Shuamore really didn't dare to move. Her body was stiff in his arms, and even her breathing was light. She was afraid that she would press him down again. It was strange. The jellyfish were swimming back and forth in the water, leisurely. However, as soon as the ancestor put his foot on them, their bodies immediately spread out and connected with each other, forming a light-colored passage. As soon as the ancestor's foot left, the jellyfish behind him spread out again like before. Ning Shuamore knew that the layout of the castle should be very dreamy, but she didn't expect it to be this dreamy. The ceiling was transparent like glass and was semicircular. When he looked up, he could see the deep blue sky outside. In the dark forest, the sky was always covered by clouds and fog, but here, he could see the real sky clearly. The sky was dark blue and there were a few white clouds floating. The reflection of the white clouds even reflected on the dark blue floor. They floated slowly, as if the sky and the world were one. Walking in the castle made people feel as if they were walking in the sky, free and unfettered among the white clouds. There was only one hall in the castle, which looked like a dreamy sky. The most conspicuous thing in the hall was a big bed. However, the bone-piercing cold was still there, causing her to shiver a few more times. Great wisdom mental cultivation method. The ancestor spoke again. Ning Shuamore's heart moved slightly. The mental cultivation method that he mentioned was the one that she had just learned from that book. She hadn't used it much yet. Hearing him mention it at this time, she immediately lowered her eyes and began to circulate this heart sutra. Speaking of which, it was strange. After circulating this heart sutra for a short while, the bone-piercing cold seemed to be driven away by something in her body and retreated. After a moment, her body returned to normal, and her little face regained its rosy color. It turned out that the reason why he asked her to get off the bed was not because he didn't allow her to sleep on the bed, but because her body was not strong enough to sleep on the bed. Ning Shuamore's displeasure lessened a little. She raised her head to look at the ancestor and was shocked. Chapter 754. The ancestor was sitting on the edge of the bed with his back to her. His outer robe and inner robe were slowly taken off from his shoulders, layer by layer, like a cloud, slowly revealing his skin that was as firm as the moonlight, and the smooth lines of his shoulder blades. His clothes slid down to his waist, and finally, his entire back was exposed. Ning Shuamore was speechless. She almost held her breath. When Di Zun was wearing clothes, it was not enough to describe his beauty. She had hugged his waist before, so she knew that his waist was thin and felt good when hugging it. At that time, Shuamore knew that his figure was definitely excellent. But his usual image was too high, so it was hard to imagine what he looked like when he was naked. He was like a high and mighty god, and people could only bow down and worship him. Who would want to take a look at a god naked? Even thinking about it felt like blasphemy. Because of this, even though Ning Shuamore had a few brief moments of physical contact with him, she never imagined what his body would look like. She knew that his body must be very good-looking, but she did not expect it to be so good. Perfect. At this moment, she could only think of this word. She had never thought that a man's back could be so beautiful. A little bit more would make her fat, a little less would make her skinny, a little whiter would make her pale, and a little darker would make her blemish. His skin was like moonlight, like satin, like jade. Every inch of it was like God's most satisfied masterpiece. It made people unable to move their eyes away. Although it was said that all beautiful appearances were false, people had the nature to appreciate beauty and chase after beauty. When you see something extremely beautiful, you can't help but take a few more glances. Just like when we are walking on the street, if we suddenly see a beautiful woman or a handsome man, we can't help but chase after them with our eyes. It was not necessarily about gender, but the instinct to chase after beauty. As a secret agent, Ning Xuemore had received all kinds of training. One of them was that she would not be fascinated by any beautiful things, so as to avoid being greedy and messing up the plan. Therefore, people like her didn't care about appearances. She had met countless handsome men and beautiful women since she transmigrated, but she had never been fascinated by their appearances. At most, she would look at them from a purely admiring point of view. However, this time, Ning Xuemore saw Di Zun's naked back and could not move her eyes away. Her eyes were fixed on his back, on those wounds. There were 3 wounds that were not very long, but extremely deep. To be exact, there were 3 broken branches of the ghost-faced tree that pierced into his back. The broken branches were still embedded in his back, blocking the wounds. Chapter 755. Although he had no choice but to show his naked back at this time, if he could charm Xuemore at the same time, it would also be a gain. A moment, a minute, 2 minutes. The Di Zun sat on the bed with his back exposed and did not rush her. The longer she charmed him, the more effective it would be. But, wasn't she staring at him for a little too long? 5 minutes had passed, but she still hadn't come back to her senses. The Di Zun's lips curved into a perfect arc under the mask. He said, "Didn't you want to treat me?" Although his voice was still light, there was a touch of gentleness. The Di Zun, can you feel how deep these 3 broken branches are? How long are they inside? Which organs are hurt? Look at the positions of these 3 broken branches. The top one is in the left atrium of the heart, the middle one is in the spleen, and the bottom one is in the left kidney. Ning Xuemore spoke in a professional doctor's tone, and then a series of professional terms. She had been lost in thought for a long time, not because she was charmed by his naked back, but because she was calculating how his wounds might have hurt his organs. How should she treat them? The Di Zun's back stiffened, and the smile on his lips unknowingly disappeared. The Di Zun, you should be able to feel how deep these broken branches are, right? Ning Xuemore had said so much in one breath, but she didn't hear any response from him. She was a little puzzled, so she asked again. "You won't faint, will you?" The Di Zun had his back to her, so she couldn't see his facial expression. But, even if he was facing her, she couldn't see it, right? After all, he was wearing a mask. She only saw him take a deep breath and finally say, "No." These 2 words were stiff. He paused, and then added a few more words. "As for how deep the branches are, how many patients know? Are you pretending to be a miracle doctor? Observe for yourself." He seemed to be in a bad temper. Well, no one would be in a good mood after suffering such a serious injury. It was so painful. Ning Xuemore was determined not to argue with him. Once she entered the doctor mode, she wouldn't care about anything else. She began to listen to his breathing, his heartbeat, and the color of his injured skin to determine how much the branches had pierced into his body. Di Zun's medical skills were also very good. Although he didn't look back, he could sense Ning Xuemore's movements and determine what she was doing. A moment later, he said faintly, "A doctor is particular about looking, listening, questioning, and feeling the pulse. Do you want to observe my complexion?" A large part of observing a person's complexion was to look at his face, tongue coating, and so on. However, he was wearing a cold jade mask. How could she tell? She had heard that when the ancestor appeared, he never took off his mask. Even his disciple didn't know what he looked like. Of course, at this time, he wouldn't take off his mask and let her see his face, right? Just as Xuemore finished her thought, the ancestor, who had his back to her, suddenly turned around slowly. Ning Xuemore's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't help but take 2 steps back. He had already taken off his mask. It had already been plucked. She revealed an astonishingly beautiful yet astonishingly cold pair of eyes. Ning Xuemore was very familiar with this face, so familiar that she couldn't pretend that she didn't know it. Han Shanyu. It was Han Shanyue's face. His facial features were definitely his, but compared to when he was Han Shanyu, he was much more three-dimensional and handsome. Compared to when he was Han Shanyu, it was also a grade higher. Chapter 757. No wonder he didn't care about all the beauties in the world. He was already so beautiful, so what kind of beauty could catch his eye? If he wanted to see a beauty, he could just look at himself in the mirror. This was really challenging the limits of her psychological endurance. Therefore, Ning Xuemo's gaze decisively shifted upwards. Stare at his mouth. His lips were too beautiful. Stare at his eyes. His eyes were too deep. She felt like she was going to drown in them. Finally, Ning Xuemo's gaze landed on his hair. Although his hair was also as smooth as satin, she was often bombarded by shampoo advertisements, so his hair wasn't that impactful. She was looking for a suitable position for her eyes when he suddenly stretched his hand in front of her eyes. His jade-like fingers made her want to play with them. Take his pulse. Yes, she should take his pulse. Ning Xuemo subconsciously placed her hand on his wrist, wanting to check his pulse. However, she didn't expect that just as her fingers touched his wrist, he would suddenly flip his wrist. Like lightning, he grabbed her wrist and abruptly pulled her into his embrace. Although Ning Xuemo was caught off guard, her martial arts were pretty good now. When he pulled her, she subconsciously took a step back. Di Zun was still seriously injured and didn't have enough strength to pull her over. Instead, he was pulled off the bed by Xuemo. He directly pounced on Ning Xuemo. Plop. This time, Ning Xuemo became his meat cushion and was pressed to the ground by him. She didn't know if it was a coincidence or if he did it on purpose, but when he pressed her down, his lips were pressed against Xuemo's lips. His body's aura completely enveloped her. Ning Xuemo widened her eyes to see his deep blue eyes that were just inches away from her. Ning Xuemo's brain went blank for a moment. She looked at him and couldn't react in time. His eyes flashed slightly, and his body moved slightly. He opened his mouth and sucked on her lips. His lips were dry and hot. The moment he sucked on her lips, Ning Xuemo's heart suddenly jumped. She felt dizzy. At the same time, she didn't know why, but there was a sense of rejection in the depths of her heart. It was this inexplicable rejection that pulled her back from her daze. She suddenly woke up and pushed him. In her nervousness, she used a little more strength. He was pushed over and rolled off her body. He fell to the ground with a plop and lay there on his back. Ning Xuemo jumped up and lowered her head to look at him. She saw that his eyebrows were deeply furrowed. His pair of eyes seemed to be looking at her, yet they also seemed to be lifeless. His lips opened and closed. Xuemo, do you not recognize me? His voice was a little hoarse, as if he was at a loss. Ning Xuemo's heart felt as if it had been struck by a sledgehammer. She stared at him. What? Chapter 758. Ning Xuemo checked the wound on the Di Zun's back. She couldn't help but touch her forehead. The 3 branches had pierced even deeper. Just a moment ago, they were still a little exposed, but now they had completely sunk into his flesh. She walked around in a circle. She had to get the branches out of his wound, but now she was empty-handed. She couldn't find any of the surgical instruments she had prepared. Without a scalpel or other surgical instruments, how could she get the branches out of his wound? She quickly searched around the castle and actually found a kitchen knife and a boning knife in a small room that was partitioned out like a storage room. These 2 things were originally sealed in a rotten wooden box. Apparently, they had been shelved for too long. There was a thick layer of dust on them. She brushed the dust away and revealed the blade. Ning Xuemo's eyes lit up. These 2 household items were actually made of millennium cold iron. Not only were they extremely sharp, but they also never rusted. With these 2 things, it wouldn't be difficult to perform the operation. Ning Xuemo had already speculated that the Di Zun should have injured his heart meridian based on his complexion and pulse. Among the 3 wounds, the uppermost one was the most dangerous, while the other 2 were only superficial wounds. In Ning Xuemo's mind, the Di Zun should be so strong that he should be invulnerable. It was hard to imagine that he could be injured like this by these branches. She had the surgical instruments, but she didn't have any antiseptic gauze or medicine. The Di Zun might have some on him, but he couldn't take them out if he didn't wake up. Xuemo didn't give up and called him a few more times. She even poked the Di Zun's palm with the jade hairpin on her head, but he still didn't wake up. Helpless, she had to take the risk and perform the operation. In order to prevent him from waking up halfway through the operation, she simply pressed a few more acupoints to make him more unconscious. The conditions here were very simple, so Ning Xuemo kept everything simple. First, she washed his back with water and then roasted the 2 knives with fire. Then, she disinfected them with fire and began the operation. Finally, she managed to pull out 2 bloody branches from the ground. Their length gave Ning Xuemo a fright. The shortest of these 2 branches was half a foot long. When he pulled them out, blood gushed out from the wounds. Fortunately, Ning Xuemo knew how to stop the bleeding by pressing acupoints. She quickly treated his wound. Because there was no medicine, she could only use the rejuvenation technique that she had just learned to clean the wound. Then, she tore a piece of her dress and bandaged the wound. It took Ning Xuemo a lot of effort to pull out the topmost branch. After all, this branch was blocking the heart meridian. If she was careless, she could cut it off and he would never wake up again. Chapter 759. The ancestor's body slightly stiffened, and he actually stopped moving. The protective barrier around his body also slowly disappeared. Ning Xuemo stared at him blankly, and there was an indescribable feeling in her heart. She felt touched and warm at the same time. People like the ancestor were used to being high and mighty. He had lived for thousands of years, and who knew how much deception and blood he had experienced. People like him wouldn't easily trust anyone. This was especially true when he was seriously injured. His current state of mind was clearly not clear, yet Xuemo was able to remove the barrier protecting his body with just a few words. This showed that in his subconscious mind, he still believed in her. He believed that she wouldn't harm him. Naturally, this wasn't the time to let her imagination run wild, so Ning Xuemo calmed down and immediately began to treat the last wound. After half an hour, she finally pulled out the branch little by little. Its length made her extremely shocked. It was almost 7 inches long. It was inserted from his back. According to this length, this thing should have pierced his heart. If a normal person was hit like this, they would have died long ago. Fortunately, he was the ancestor. He had already cultivated to become an immortal, right? That was why he could follow her for so long after his heart was pierced, and even carry her to this illusory castle. She looked at the end of the branch that had pierced his flesh. The tip was sharp, and the color was a little strange. It faintly emitted a charming purple color, and even emitted a faint fluorescent light. What was going on? She knew that this branch was poisonous, so when she pulled it out, she used a snow-white handkerchief as a cushion. However, this poison shouldn't have much effect on the ancestor, because when she pulled out the 2 branches, she didn't find any abnormalities. The color of the blood flowing out of his body was also normal. Why was the tip of the last branch so strange? Ning Xuemo was still worried, so she put the tip of the branch close to her nose and smelled it. A kind of fishy sweet fragrance like medicine and flowers seeped into her nose. Heavens! This smell! It smells so good. Ning Xuemo had never smelled this fragrance before. She had never smelled such a nice fragrance in her entire life. It was as if a small hand had reached out from the fragrance and pinched her stomach. An indescribable taste rose from her dantian. It was as if there was a starving child jumping around and shouting, causing her to salivate in an instant. She wished she could chew up the blood-stained stick in her hand and eat it. This feeling came so suddenly that she couldn't help but bring the branch closer to her lips. The ancestor suddenly let out a soft groan. His voice was not loud, but it was like a sudden clap of thunder that struck Ning Xuemo's head. She had almost lost her mind, but she was instantly clear-headed. Chapter 760. A thought suddenly floated into Shuemore's mind. Could it be that the bright purple blood was the color of the ancestor's heart? That's impossible, right? Shouldn't the color of blood be the same? How could only the blood of the heart be special? As she pondered, she quickly tended to his wound. She had done everything she could. Now she just had to wait for him to wake up and see if he had any medicine on him. Ning Shuemore tidied up the miscellaneous items, cleaned the 2 knives, and put them aside. She then looked at the ancestor. The ancestor was lying on his side with his eyes slightly closed. There was a faint white mist surrounding his body on the cloud bed, as if it was revolving around him and healing his wounds. That cloud bed seemed to be his personal item. Ning Shuemore still couldn't touch it. When she touched it with her hand, she felt that it was cold to the bone. He was lying on it, but he didn't seem to be cold at all. Ning Shuemore sat next to him and observed for a while. Seeing that he didn't move and his complexion didn't change, she felt relieved. It was only at this moment that she was in the mood to walk around this fairy-tale-like castle. At first glance, it looked like there was only one hall in this place, but after careful observation, Ning Shuemore found 2 small doors. These 2 small doors blended in with the surrounding light blue walls. She couldn't even see a crack. If she didn't know about mechanisms, she wouldn't have been able to find them. Of these 2 small halls, one was a storage room. The 2 knives were found here. The other room was completely empty. Only the ancestor could come to this place. It should be a place where he cultivated, right? She didn't expect that such a cold person would have such a fairy-tale-like house. Could it be that such a lofty person also subconsciously longed for childlike fun? She walked around the hall again and sat down on a chair that looked like a white cloud. She looked up at the ceiling of the hall and watched the clouds pass by. She couldn't help but sigh. This place was really romantic. If you brought your loved one here for a vacation, you could see the blue sky and white clouds during the day and the vast galaxy at night. That would really be the life of an immortal. She couldn't help but look at the big bed again. It was such a big bed. If only she could lie down on it. Lying on the cloud bed and looking at the scenery above would be even more beautiful. If she could lie down on it with her lover, nesting in her lover's arms, it would be even better. What a pity. She couldn't go up. She touched her nose and looked at the Di-Zun above her. Forget it. Even if she could go up, she couldn't lie down with the ancestor. She was also a little tired, but in order to take care of the seriously injured Di-Zun, she didn't dare to rest. She stayed in the hall and looked at the scenery in the sky for a while, then came out to see if Kireen had returned. It was the most difficult to fathom the thoughts of people like him, and it was difficult to fathom. Therefore, Ning Shuemore rejected him from the bottom of her heart due to all these factors. Later on, as they interacted again and again, she began to subconsciously treat him as a protective umbrella. Unknowingly, he had also walked into her heart. When you don't care about someone, they can't hurt you no matter what they do. But when you start to care about someone, you will care about everything that you didn't care about before. For example, his real name, his real identity, and the fact that he only wanted her to be a concubine. If she didn't have feelings for him, she wouldn't care about these things. But when he lifted the carriage like a knight and saved her from Shuerilan, Shuemore lay in his arms and felt comforted and at ease. She had even forgotten to ask if the Momo he spoke of was the same person as her, until he suddenly flipped over and pressed her under his body. Her back was pressed against the cold cloud bed. That bone-chilling cold was like a venomous snake as it traveled from her back to her entire body and rushed into her brain. She shuddered violently. That bone-chilling coldness almost froze her, but at the same time, it also cleared her mind. Fortunately, his body was burning hot, and he had stuck close to her for a long time, so she didn't freeze the moment she touched the cloud bed. His hands and feet were still very nimble. Shuemore secretly took a breath. She exerted strength in her arms and finally pushed him off her body. Then, she suddenly flipped over and finally escaped from the cloud bed. Her movements were too hasty, and her heart was too flustered. She staggered and almost fell to the ground. Chapter 766. Ning Xuemore quickly steadied herself and waited for her heartbeat to calm down before turning to look at him. She saw the overlord lying on his back with his clothes wide open. His forehead was full of sweat, but his face was pale. Cold. He spat out a word. Brother, that cloud bed could freeze a person into a lump of ice. Of course it was cold. A normal person like her wouldn't be able to stand it, let alone a seriously ill person like him. Looking at his body shivering, Ning Xuemore forgot the awkwardness of the kiss and hurriedly went forward to carry him down from the cloud bed. She didn't have a place to put him down, but she couldn't put him on the ground. She saw a few cloud-like praying mats not far away, so she pulled them over with her legs and arranged them together. Then, she put him on the praying mats. When she lowered her head and saw his clothes were wide open, her heart skipped a beat. She quickly gathered his clothes and wrapped them tightly around him again. The Almighty looked like a real Almighty when his clothes were tightly buttoned up. His current appearance didn't feel like him at all. Finally, Ning Xuemore tidied him up. Suddenly, she felt that her chest was leaking air. She looked down and her face became hot. Her lapel was also wide open. It revealed the light pink doo-doo inside. Even the doo-doo had fallen off halfway, revealing more than half of her chest. She finally remembered the passionate kiss just now. Her face became hot again. It turned out that the Almighty knew how to be a hooligan even when he was unconscious. Sure enough, a man's instincts didn't need to be taught. Was it really his first time being intimate with a woman? It didn't feel like it was his first time. That technique, that kiss, it was so familiar as if he knew where her sensitive spots were. Thinking of that kiss, that gentle and strong touch, her heart, which had just calmed down, started to beat wildly again. She shook her head violently. She couldn't think about it anymore. Although Ning Xuemore was smart, it was her first time being so intimate with a man, so she couldn't figure out if the man was unfamiliar or familiar with it. She looked at the cloud bed with lingering fear. If it wasn't for the cold bed that woke her up instantly, she might have hit a home run with him and given herself to him in a daze. Even if he wanted to give it to him, he had to do it when he was sober, right? Otherwise, if he ate it, he might not admit it after he woke up. Why did he think of this? Crazy. I'm probably too tired. I'm a little crazy. His imagination was wild and unconstrained, and his imagination ran wild. She patted her head and looked at her image. She couldn't help but want to rub her forehead. Too open. She was simply too open right now. If someone were to see this, they might even label her as a slut. If he saw it when he was awake, she was afraid that he would say that she was frivolous again. Damn it. Why did she think of him again? Ning Xuemore hurriedly dressed herself up and put on the doo-doo again. She was still not used to wearing it, and she always felt that it was not as comfortable as underwear. However, she only had this set of clothes now, so she could only make do with it. She buttoned her clothes tightly to make herself look like a well-behaved lady. After confirming that there was nothing wrong with her body, she let out a long sigh of relief. When she turned back to look at Di Zun, she couldn't help but moan. Oh my God. He had a high fever again. Xuemore touched his forehead and felt that he was about to spontaneously combust from the heat. Ning Xuemore was cold. She was really cold. It was so cold that her teeth began to chatter. The ancestor seemed to have sensed her trembling in a daze. His body slightly stiffened, and his arms released her. He even gave her a push and forced out a word, "Go." Ning Xuemore was speechless. She was pushed out of the ancestor's embrace, so naturally, she wasn't that cold. Xuemore lay next to him in a daze for a moment. She saw that his thin lips were tightly pursed and covered with a layer of frost. His fingers were tightly clenched, and his fingertips were pale. It was obvious that he was trying to restrain the bone-chilling cold. Did he regain some of his consciousness? Did he just push her aside after regaining his consciousness? Ning Xuemore suddenly became angry. Without saying anything further, she forcefully pulled his arm away and squeezed into his embrace. She used her arms to hug his waist and wrapped her legs around his legs. She fiercely said, "You better behave yourself." As time passed, the sky above his head gradually darkened. Stars appeared one by one and gradually covered the entire sky. They twinkled like diamonds scattered all over the sky. The stars was Hope Eyes. The luminous pearl in the hall that looked like a small moon gradually lit up. The floor clearly reflected the shadows of the stars in the sky, as if it was another starry sky. The starry sky above and below reflected each other. This scene could not be described with just one word. This scenery was originally a beautiful scenery. But as Ning Xuemore sat there, she felt an indescribable loneliness and desolation. Just like how there was no signal in the mountainous area, there was no signal in the directed audio talisman here either. She was hungry and tired. Originally, she wanted to keep staring at the ancestor, but she fell asleep in a daze. She dreamt of a dream. Green hills and clear waters. High and low mountain peaks were scattered all around in picturesque disorder. Ning Xuemore walked among them, and her heart was a little absent-minded. She did not know why she was here. In front of her, there was a clump of waist-high grass that made a low panting sound. Ning Xuemore curiously walked over, and when she saw what was inside, she was stunned. Nestled inside was a snow-white furball that was half stained with blood. It was a little fox with 8 long furry tails behind it. He didn't seem to be wearing a mask, but Ning Xuemore couldn't see his face clearly even though she tried her best. It must have been separated by some kind of spell. The man was playing a jade flute in his hand. The heavenly wind lifted his sleeves, making them flutter like a butterfly spreading its wings. The man's expression was focused, as if he didn't care about anything. The sound of his flute caused hundreds of birds to circle in the sky and the beasts to sway on the ground, as if they were dancing to the sound of his flute. When the song ended, the man slowly stood up. It was obvious that he did not want to play anymore. Only then did the birds and beasts reluctantly disperse. The little fox seemed to have specially come to listen to the song. When the man in white finished playing, it also wanted to turn around and leave. But it had lost too much blood. As soon as it turned around, it staggered and fell down. The little fox whimpered twice and struggled a few times on the ground. It wanted to get up, but it didn't succeed. Chapter 771. A white robe appeared in front of Ning Xuemore's eyes. She didn't know when the man had come down from the mountain and was walking towards the little fox. Her heart couldn't help but jump. The man would extend a helping hand to the little fox, right? After all, the little fox had suffered such a serious injury and still came to listen to his music. It could be said that it was half a soulmate to him. Moreover, the little fox looked so cute. The white robe floated across the grass and a corner of the robe even touched the little fox's head. But the man didn't stop walking. He actually didn't stop. Ning Xuemore clenched her fists. How cold-blooded. Too cold-blooded. Woo-ah. The little fox also cried out in a low voice from the grass. Its pair of gem-like black eyes looked at the man's back as he quietly left and lowered its head. It closed its eyes and panted for a while before it turned around and slowly walked in another direction. It walked very slowly and Ning Xuemore followed it. She felt that her point of view was the little fox's point of view. Whatever it saw, she saw. Suddenly, the little fox staggered and fell to the ground and fainted. Even Ning Xuemore's vision turned black. When the darkness in front of her dispersed, Ning Xuemore found that she had changed to another place. In front of her was a bonfire and beside the bonfire, the man in white was sitting on a green rock. In his hand was the 8-tailed little fox. The little fox's 4 little claws were in front of its chest. When it was picked up by the man, it opened its eyes in a daze. When it saw the man in white's face, its eyes lit up and it stretched out its little claws to hook the man's sleeve. The man held it in his hand and looked at it for a moment. The light-colored corners of his lips seemed to curl up slightly. I have eaten a lot of meat, but I have never eaten fox meat. I don't know what it tastes like. Although this little fox is a little thin, perhaps the lean meat will be more chewy. He looked at it as if he was looking at a wild rabbit. The little fox's body stiffened and suddenly struggled vigorously in his hand. The man seemed to be caught off guard and was thrown to the ground by it. The little fox rolled on the ground and immediately jumped up, turned around, and ran away. Fearing that the man would eat it, it waved its little claws and released a faint red light, attacking the man. The man flicked his sleeve, and the faint red light disappeared. He waved his hand again, and the little fox, which had just run 30 to 40 feet away, automatically flew back into his hand. You know some yarrow arts? The male picked it up in front of his eyes. Then do you know how to speak? The little fox closed its eyes and pretended to be dead. Looks like it hasn't gained sentience yet. I can finally eat fox meat. The man's voice was faint, but it was as if he had just sentenced the little fox to death. Chapter 772. Its claws were as sharp as knives. If it really scratched its body, there would definitely be several cuts on its fur. The man seemed to have guessed the little fox's thoughts. He raised his finger and pressed down on its little claws. Self-mutilation? The little fox couldn't move anymore. It stared at the man in front of it, and its beautiful eyes finally became misty. My fur isn't perfect anymore. There are a few holes in it. I can't make a sleeve, and it won't look good even if I make one. Oh, that's true. The man's gaze fell on its body. There was indeed a large tear on its left side, and blood was still seeping out. You've been injured for 2 hours, right? Since you've gained sentience, why don't you heal yourself? The man's voice sounded slightly displeased. The little fox said, I'm seriously injured. I can't transform, so I can't heal myself. There seemed to be a glimmer of hope in its eyes. My fur is broken, so it's no longer perfect. You won't skin me anymore, right? I really don't like things with imperfections. The man's voice sounded regretful. Then I won't skin you. The little fox's eyes lit up. It struggled in his hands. Then put me down. Sure enough, the man placed it on the bluestone, but he had no intention of letting it go. He took out a crimson medicine bottle from somewhere and slowly applied the medicine to it while saying, I can cure you now. When all the fur is as smooth as before, I'll peel it off. The little fox froze. Even Ning Shuemor, who was standing at the side, couldn't help but burst out laughing. She could already tell that the man was teasing the little fox. The little fox's eyes were watery, and its little mouth was tightly pursed. It seemed like it didn't know what to say. The man was very skilled at healing, and the medicine was also very effective. Almost at the same time, the wound stopped bleeding. He took out a roll of bandages from nowhere and wrapped the little fox's wound tightly. When he put it on the ground, the little fox almost couldn't run anymore. Its hind legs were also bandaged. It probably thought that it wouldn't be in danger for the time being, so it simply lay down beside the man and stared blankly at the crackling bonfire. The man ignored it. With a flick of his wrist, a guqin appeared on his knees, and he began to play. The little fox's eyes lit up as she stared at his zither. She didn't even blink as she watched his fingers play the zither. The sound of the zither was unprecedentedly beautiful. The beautiful sound of the zither gradually summoned hundreds of birds and beasts. Ning Shuemor was also somewhat entranced. This man's musical talent was extremely high. Regardless of whether it was the flute or the zither, he could play them to perfection. It was definitely not an exaggeration to say that he would be remembered for 3 days. Chapter 774. The little girl watched from the side and swallowed her saliva. She watched as the man took down a roasted rabbit from the branch. She couldn't help but go over and squat by his feet. She pulled one of his sleeves and asked, "Can I hunt 2 more rabbits in exchange for a rabbit leg?" "1 leg is enough." Her eyes shone brightly under the bonfire. The man looked down at the little hand that was holding his sleeve and waved it away without batting an eyelid. The little girl's eyes dimmed and she took 2 steps back. "Can I go now?" The man glanced at her and said lightly, "Wait a little longer." The little girl knew that she was no match for him, so she didn't play any tricks. She watched as the man finished eating the 2 rabbits, leaving only a rabbit leg. The man stopped eating. He held the rabbit leg in his hand and glanced at the little girl. The little girl was probably starving. She swallowed a mouthful of saliva and stared at the rabbit leg. However, she couldn't bring herself to ask for it again. The man tossed the rabbit leg in his palm. "Do you want to eat it?" The little girl paused for a moment. She was probably stubborn. She pursed her lips and said, "No." Her stomach growled. The man's eyes flashed. He suddenly patted his sleeve and a furry mink came out. The mink had 3 tails and it stared at the rabbit leg as soon as it came out. The man threw the rabbit leg in the air between the little mink and the little girl. The little girl was stunned. The rabbit leg was very close to her. She could almost reach it with her hand, but her pride didn't allow her to do so. The little mink didn't care about this. It jumped in the air and bit the rabbit leg. It held it with its 2 front paws and ate it happily. The little girl was speechless. Her little face was red and her big eyes were misty. At this moment, Ning Xuemore unexpectedly read her grievances. She was obviously hungry. She was the one who hunted the rabbit, but now the mink took advantage of it. The little girl suddenly turned around and ran away. She didn't want to talk to this man anymore. She would never listen to him play the zither or the flute again. She suddenly tripped and rolled on the ground. A white light flashed and she was forced to turn back into a little fox. The man flicked his sleeve, and its body flew back, landing not far from the mink. The mink proudly looked at it before lowering its head to continue gnawing on the rabbit leg. The little fox could only watch helplessly. The man didn't even look at it as he said indifferently, "Remember, there are some things that you have to fight for with your life. If you don't fight for it, what originally belonged to you will be snatched away by others." The little fox was originally looking at him angrily, but when she heard his words, she was stunned. Her eyes seemed to flash with light. The man leisurely stood up, his sleeves fluttering as he left in a carefree manner. He didn't even want that mink anymore. "Mo, you still went easy on her." The voice sounded again. "You should kill her. It would be best if you cut off her head." Shui Mo pursed her lips, still kneeling on the ground. Finally, she asked, "Why? She and I are twin sisters, so why must one of us die?" This was what she couldn't understand the most. "Why?" The voice repeated softly and laughed. "Silly child, because there can only be one fiend ancestor. The fiend ancestor's children have always been twins. The strong will inherit the fiend ancestor's position, and the weak will only have one word, death. That's why our Sai tried so hard to scheme against you. That's why she tried to kill you again and again. I thought she would win because she was more ruthless than you. I didn't expect you to win, and you even let her live. Snow Yi Mo, Snow Yi Tong, haha, when combined, they were strangers. They were destined to be strangers." Chapter 777. It's really beyond my expectations. However, your zither skills are indeed much better than our Yarrow's. I'm very pleased. What about her? Shui Yimo couldn't help but ask. A loser. Why do you care where she went? The voice became cold. Yes. Shui Yimo replied. Mo, remember, as a devil, the most taboo is affection. Whether it's family, friendship, or love, you must abandon them all. Mo will remember. Hihi, you still lack tempering. My successor. Shui Yimo's fingers clenched tightly in her sleeves. Lord Devil Ancestor. Mo still doesn't understand. Since our Yarrow and I will become enemies sooner or later, why did you make us love each other so much when we were children? Lord Devil Ancestor also said that our Yarrow and our Mo must advance and retreat together, live and die together. Her lips were about to turn white. Since they were destined to be life and death enemies, why did you make them so close when they were children, so close that they were like one person, hey? The Devil Ancestor laughed coldly, carrying a bone-piercing chill. What do you think? Shui Yimo shivered and didn't dare to speak again. After all, she was still young and couldn't figure out the crux of the matter. Ning Xuemore was, after all, experienced in the world. She faintly felt a chill in her heart. She understood the Devil Ancestor's intentions. To become the Devil Ancestor, one must be ruthless and emotionless. The more Shui Yimo and Shui Yimo loved each other when they were young, the greater the psychological impact when they became enemies when they grew up would be, and the easier it would be to temper their demonic nature. Remember, no one in this world can be trusted. No one can make you pity them. This Lord will pass on half of my demonic power to you. Practice this blackwave zither well. This Lord will wait for the day when you can go into battle alone to kill enemies. The blackwave zither needs you to feed it with human blood. An orchid zither appeared at Shui Yimo's feet. It faintly emitted a light luster, beautiful and evil. Shui Yimo slowly reached out and hugged the zither, replying with a single word, yes. The scene quickly changed again. Ning Xuemore saw Shui Yimo practicing the zither every day. The blood on his fingers blistered and broke, dripping with blood from time to time. She finally sat in a blood-red carriage, but she was sitting in the middle of the carriage, and there was another person sitting in the middle of the carriage. The blood-red chariot was protected in the middle by a dense mass of demon soldiers. They were fighting with what seemed to be people from the immortal world. Blood flowed like a river, and white bones were scattered. The person in the carriage was also playing the zither, but the sound was very ordinary. The one who had truly released the killing sound and used the sound waves to kill was Snowy Immortal, who was sitting in the mezzanine. The people in the carriage would change from time to time, but Shui Yimo, who was in the compartment, couldn't be changed. She was the only one. Every note was a killing weapon, and every note would slit the opponent's throat. The blackwave zither was like the scythe of the Grim Reaper, reaping countless lives on the battlefield. As for Shui Yimo, she had gone from vomiting when she first went to the battlefield, to being numb, and then to talking and laughing while killing. The frequent killings turned the once naive girl into a beautiful little devil. Her zither skills became better and better, and the number of people she killed also increased. Not only did she have to deal with people from the immortal world on the battlefield, she also had to deal with wave after wave of assassinations in the demon world. Those who came to assassinate her included her former good friends, her former loyal subordinates, and even her maids. Chapter 779. She nestled herself in the ancestor's arms without any trace of politeness. One of her hands was holding onto his lapel, and the other leg was wrapped around his waist. This position was simply like the most intimate of lovers hugging each other to sleep. When did she and the Di Zun sleep so well together? Ning Xuemore's face turned red, and she hurriedly stepped back. There was no obstruction on all sides of the bed, and she retreated too quickly, so she almost fell from the other side. Be careful, he said faintly. He stretched out his hand and pulled her back. Are you okay? Ning Xuemore almost fell into his arms again after being pulled by his hand. She hurriedly used the weight of 1,000 pounds to stabilize her body in place. The Di Zun looked at her without saying anything. He never answered other people's nonsense. Now that he was able to lie by her side and not in that ice shell, he naturally recovered. Although he hadn't completely recovered, he could move freely. His gaze was too deep, and Ning Xuemore's scalp went numb from his gaze. She coughed and wanted to turn over and sit up. A hand was placed on her shoulder. Lie down with this king for a while. Although he didn't use any strength, Ning Xuemore couldn't break free if she didn't struggle vigorously. At this time, struggling vigorously was too artificial. Therefore, Ning Xuemore had no choice but to no longer get up, but she quietly moved away slightly. She really felt a little pressured to sleep in the same bed as the Di-Zun. Especially on a night like this, when she was covered with a blanket. The Di-Zun naturally noticed her small movements, but he didn't say anything. His eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't do anything else. He turned over and lay down, looking up at the vast sky above his head, and sighed softly. Rongyue Tianlan had said that when a girl rejected you, you must remember to be impulsive, so as to not scare the other party away. You must plan slowly. The Di-Zun had never lacked patience. He could wait. In any case, she was now in his bed, beside him. Ning Xuemo saw him like this and secretly sighed in relief. She didn't want to be too intimate with him right now because she didn't know her own feelings. She had already calmly examined his complexion just now. He was no longer so pale, and his breathing was even. He should be fine. She put down her worries and lay down. The stars were bright and reflected in her eyes. From where she was, she could see the stars twinkling in the sky. Ning Xuemo's body was covered with a cloud quilt, and the quilt was as soft as a cloud. There were large and small clouds around her body. The four walls and floor were dark blue, and the stars were bright and dark. For a moment, she had the illusion of lying in the clouds and looking at the stars. Ning Xuemo couldn't help but touch the bedding beneath her. The bedding was extremely soft and warm, making it very comfortable to lie on.